Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. Topic for today's webinar is Solar with Justice, a new report on solar for under-resourced communities. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance, also known as CESA. Before I pass it over to our speakers for today, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees for this webinar are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can connect using your computer mic and speakers, or you can call in using a telephone. If you'd like to minimize your webinar console to view the webinar full screen, you can click on the little orange arrow that you see circled here, and that also works to expand the webinar console. A very important note, we ask that you please submit questions throughout the webinar, questions and comments, by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will get to as many questions as we can following our presentations. We're saving about 15-20 minutes for Q&A with the audience. So do type your questions in when you think of them. Don't wait until the end, and we will get to as many questions as we can. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you an email with a copy of the webinar recording and a PDF of the slides probably this afternoon, at least within about 48 hours. And we'll also be posting those webinar materials on our website at cesa.org/webinars. That's a good URL to know about because we also post our upcoming webinars there. So with that, I'd like to pass this over to our moderator for today's webinar, Nate Hausman. Nate is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he's going to be starting us off today. Nate?
Great, thanks, Sam. Sure enough, my name is Nate Hausman, and I am a project director at the Clean Energy States Alliance. First, just a quick note about the Clean Energy States Alliance, or CESA. We are a national nonprofit coalition of public agencies and organizations. We work together to advance clean energy. We're mostly made up of state-level agencies and organizations. You can see some of the logos of our members on this slide. So this webinar is on our recently released Solar with Justice report. We're very excited about the release of this report. It's been a team effort. It's been a long time in the making, and we're very proud of it. So we're going to provide an overview of the report, and to speak with us about the contents of the report, we have Danielle Deane-Ryan of the Nathan Cummings Foundation, Chandra Farley of the Partnership for Southern Equity, and Warren Leon of CESA. So I'll introduce all three of them now at the outset, and then I'll turn it over to them. So first, in speaking order, we have Danielle Deane-Ryan. She's the director of the Inclusive Clean Energy Economy Program at the Nathan Cummings Foundation. She served in the Obama administration as senior advisor for external affairs and acting director for stakeholder engagement at the U.S. Department of Energy's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. Prior, she held roles at the Robin Group, serving as Green 2.0's founding executive director, the Hewlett Foundation, and served on the National Academies of Sciences Gulf Research Programs Advisory Board. She holds an MS in Environment and Development from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Next, you'll hear from Chandra Farley, who's the director of the Just Energy Program for the Partnership for Southern Equity. She provides leadership strategy and coaching to ensure a program achieves its energy equity goals and optimizes its impact in the community. She works in partnership with environmental and equity organizations throughout the American South to engage diverse communities around issues of energy inequity, democracy, and climate justice. She was previously a program manager for South Face Energy Institute. And last up, you'll hear from Warren Leon, who's the executive director of the Clean Energy States Alliance. Warren oversees the organization's day-to-day operations and leads strategy development. He's previously produced many reports for CESA, including Returning Champions that was produced just a couple of months ago. Prior to working at CESA, he was director of the Massachusetts Renewable Energy Trust, executive director of the Northeast Sustainable Energy Association, and deputy Deputy Director for Programs at the Union of Concerned Scientists. He holds a PhD from Harvard University. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to you, Danielle, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Nate. Good morning, everyone, and a special thank you to CESA for including me on this webinar and for your partnership. The Nathan Cummings Foundation focuses on solutions to the twin issues of the climate crisis and inequality, and we're very pleased to have funded this report, Solar with Justice, Strategies for Powering Up Under-Resourced Communities and Growing an Inclusive Solar Market. The idea for this report emerged as a recommendation from the Nathan Cummings Foundation's grantee partners at a convening that we co-hosted with the Solutions Project. So I bring greetings as well from the president of the Nathan Cummings Foundation, Sharon Alpert, and Sarah Shanley Hope, executive director of the Solutions Project. The solar economy, as you all well know, is booming. And in 2018, the solar industry generated $17 billion of investment in the American economy, according to the Solar Energy Industry Association. But it's missing the mark on inclusion. Too often, the communities who could benefit the most from clean, less expensive solar energy, who face those high burdens of energy costs and are in need of economic development, are the last to get access to solar. This is not just a missed opportunity for under-resourced communities, it's also short-sighted politically, as we seek to boost support for clean energy and foster a just transition in the context of addressing the climate crisis. Addressing equity is both the moral thing to do and, given the politics of the moment, the smart thing to do. Our grantee partners and allies at that convening a year and a half ago shared that they were having challenges as they tried different models, keeping track of best practices and innovations in the field as they looked at different economic inclusion models. And in some ways, with all the innovation, it's the wild, wild west out there. So in addition to saving money, which might seem like an obvious thing that everyone definitely wants, our leaders went further. They wanted to understand, how do you maximize the jobs and the wealth building opportunities? Thus, this new report takes an evaluative look at the policies and projects across the country, draws out lessons learned, and critically, it takes care to lift up leaders from the very underserved communities who are working on inclusion in solar. Those grantees and partners shaped this report, which is informed by over 80 interviews and features 11 case studies. And there's a cheat sheet of those case studies and highlights at the back of the report. Ultimately, the goal for the Solar with Justice report is to accelerate the implementation of solar in under-resourced communities in ways that provide meaningful, long-lasting benefits to those communities. The recommendations set a path for increasing solar deployment in ways that result in significant economic equity and health improvements. A point of pride about this report, and a distinguishing feature of it, care was really taken to put together a diverse project team that included leaders with deep and varied experience working on solar policy, energy equity, community development, and project financing. The project is richer for the process and teamwork, and I want to especially thank CESA and Warren Leon and his team, and Chandra Farley, who's on this call, and her team, and professors at the Jackson State University and University of Michigan, who came together to work on this. The partnership was rich in bringing together grassroots and grass-tops partners who had a range of backgrounds and perspectives, but had a deep shared commitment to making the clean energy economy more inclusive. The report has recommendations for funders in the foundation space and philanthropy space, as well as other types of financial institutions, government, frontline leaders, and the solar industry. We know that foundations in particular, who I know many of you work with, influence the agenda in helping to shape the narrative on equity, and how critical it is for everyone working on this to center equity on their strategies and take care with how they seek input and who they convene. With that, very pleased to turn it over to Warren.
Actually, this is Warren, but before you go, thank you. Before you go to me, let's go to Chandra.
Thank you, Warren, and thank you, Danielle. Again, this is Chandra Farley with the Partnership for Southern Equity. We are a racial equity organization based in Atlanta, Georgia. advancing racial equity and shared prosperity for all across metropolitan Atlanta, the state of Georgia, and the American South. We were thrilled to be engaged in this report, particularly as our founder and chief equity officer, Nathaniel Smith, and vice president of strategy and engagement, Dwayne Patterson, were a part of the 2018 convening that led to this project. Many times, community representatives are asked to convene, charrette, ideate, etc., around all kinds of ideas, but there's very often no concrete deliverable behind it. So the process that we were able to be a part of, along with many of our grassroots and frontline partners, was different and energizing, as not only was the report a concrete deliverable, but we also, as Danielle mentioned in the report, have broken down tangible steps to develop solar projects through an equity lens. Over the course of the development of the report, we also had real discussion about what much of the language we used in the report means. We had real discussion amongst the program team and in our original convening. You see the photo there of many of those participants. And being able to make the space for those kinds of conversations is critically necessary. As we say at Partnership for Southern Equity, equity is a way of doing things. It's not a what. So making the space for these conversations, the authentic engagement of many of the community leaders and frontline representatives you see in the photo. There were many more engaged through multiple interviews, phone conversations. Over the course of the development of the report, we were able to engage them in our communication strategy development through various webinars, even asking for their input on some of the names that began to bubble up. So this was really a great example of what it looks like to authentically engage community and frontline or grassroots groups in the development of the kind of technical resources that are critically needed, not just to move a project forward, but also educate. The process of educating and building capacity when you're working with communities to build power is just as important as the project outcome. So I am very appreciative of the opportunity to be a part of this project, and in particular, be able to represent not just this Partnership for Southern Equity, but along with many of the frontline and grassroots groups who are part of our wider network that focuses on a collaborative called Advancing Equity and Opportunity across the South. Many times, the South can be left out of these conversations, as we do lag behind relative to clean energy and investment and project development. So this was a great process. We continue to benefit from the many leaders who were at the original 2018 convening, the 2019 convening, and many of us are already talking about how we continue to work together to leverage the tools that are in the report. And I will turn it back over to Warren.
Hey, thank you very much, Chandra, and thanks, Danielle. It was great to work with both of them and the other members of the project team on the report. And I think we've ended up with a really good document that should be useful to a wide range of stakeholders. And what I'm going to do is to take 20 minutes to give you an overview and a roadmap to what is a very detailed report, in the hope that you'll be able to know which parts of it you want to go to and look at most carefully. The report's divided into really two halves. The first part of it is background, and we have three topical chapters. The first one is on challenges under-resourced communities face and how solar can help. Under-resourced communities have a large number of economic challenges facing them, and solar has the ability to address some of those challenges. Solar has the ability to not only help people save money on their utility bills, but give them more control over their energy and economic lives. It has the potential to actually create wealth in under-resourced communities. The only catch is, as we talk about in Chapter 2, is there's lots of obstacles to developing solar in under-resourced communities. It is not easy, and anybody who wants to address this topic needs to have a good sense going into it as to what some of those obstacles are, because otherwise you'll just run into barriers and things won't proceed well. You know, and we talk about in that chapter the wide range of obstacles people need to be aware of. For example, obstacles having to do with some of the requirements that the Department of Housing and Urban Development has for individuals who receive housing assistance. That impacts the ways in which they can and can't benefit from solar. We then have a third chapter on the importance of community empowerment. As you heard from Danielle and from Chandra, we wanted to focus on how solar could not just lead to some bill savings, but it can really empower people in under-resourced communities to be able to take control over their lives. And that third chapter talks about the importance of that, and it also includes a step-by-step approach on how to include community empowerment as part of efforts to build solar in under-resourced communities. Before I go to the second part of the report, I want to talk about something that came up with us relatively early on that became an interesting issue. And this had to do with the term community solar. We realized that different groups define this term very differently. And there was a lot of misunderstanding because people were not talking about the same thing when they were talking about community solar. For the solar industry and for the U.S. Department of Energy and for utilities, when they talk about solar, community solar, what they mean is a shared solar array in some centralized location where a significant number of people can all purchase subscriptions into that shared solar array. The array doesn't need to necessarily be in their neighborhood or their backyard. Sometimes there could be a community solar project in one town that people in 5 towns around all buy into. Well, that's one definition of community solar. But when folks from grassroots energy equity and environmental justice organizations talked about community solar, what they meant was a project that was controlled by the local community, in the local community, that provided benefits for the local community. They meant something very different. A project on a church that didn't have subscribers, completely owned by the church, they would think of that as a community solar project. Well, to avoid confusion over terms, in our report, when we're talking about the subscription-based group solar projects where lots of people buy subscriptions into, we talk about that as shared solar. When we talk about a project in a community designed to benefit that community, that's controlled by the community, we talk about that as locally controlled solar. In the second part of our report, and this is the bulk of the report, we focus on findings and recommendations. We start with a chapter with some general findings and recommendations that we think are relevant to all the stakeholders in the solar space. And then we follow it up with chapters aimed at particular groups. One chapter aimed at state governments, another aimed at philanthropic foundations, another aimed at community organizations, another aimed at other stakeholders like the solar industry, municipalities, and so on. And we follow up with a chapter on project financing because we think that's a topic that's very important and it deserved its own attention. The chapter, and spread out through the report is a series of 11 case studies. And as Danielle mentioned at the beginning, we included an appendix, which sort of a cheat sheet to be able to compare these case studies and see what they're all about. But these case studies range from some very small projects to ones of many multi-million dollars that could only be implemented by a state government or a major foundation. But we think all of these case studies suggest programs and projects that deserve to be replicated more widely. And we hope you look at them and see which ones you want to try to replicate. Let me talk about the top 10 general findings and recommendations. I'm not going to be able to talk about all the recommendations in the report, but I do want to talk about a few here before we go on to the recommendations in the other chapters. We lead with the recommendations that partnerships involving trusted community organizations are essential. We really believe that if you're going to do solar in under-resourced communities in ways that there are significant benefits to those communities, in ways in which the projects end up being well received and popular, and there's lots of buy-in and things proceed smoothly, it's crucial that there be partnerships between community organizations and the other players involved in developing the project. Community organizations understand the needs of their community. They can help educate the community about the project, and they could provide useful information and insights that can be used by solar developers in deciding how to proceed. I want to talk about recommendation 3 as well. We think that installations for community institutions deserve special consideration. And there's several reasons for that. One reason is certain types of residents of under-resourced communities can have a hard time benefiting directly from solar installations, especially renters. It can be done, and we talk about how it can be done, but it's not necessarily easy to do. But if you do things that benefit institutions that serve the community and serve a large number of people in that community, you could reduce the operating costs for those institutions, and they have more money for their mission-related activities. On top of that, the community institutions, if they install solar, it's likely to be highly visible. It serves a valuable educational purpose. And for example, if you put solar on a church, every member of that congregation learns about solar, feels part of the installation, and feels that they're participating in the transition to a solar economy. Recommendation 5, financial risk needs to be minimized for LMI households and community organizations. Now, that may seem obvious, but it is often not emphasized strongly enough. When you're operating within a community where you're dealing with folks who have low incomes, the whole subject of risk is different than if you're dealing with a more well-to-do population. If there's something in which you're dealing with someone who makes $200,000 a year, and they can get a solar project and they have a 90% chance of saving money, but because of possible changes in the electricity market, there's a 10% chance that they'll lose $1,000. That's a great investment. 90% chance you're going to make money, and if you lose $1,000, it's not going to be such a big deal. Well, if you're dealing with a low-income population, a loss of $1,000 could be enough to mean the person can't keep up with their rent payments, can't pay their utility bills, will have to put aside some other necessary purchases. For solar, for low-income households to work, it has to be risk-free. There have to be guarantees that the people are not going to lose money. And that relates to the next recommendation, that strong consumer protection is crucial. Most people who installed solar or have purchased solar have been very happy with their decisions. But there are some bad actors out there. Not many, but there are some. And on top of that, beyond the issue of bad actors, there are some folks who don't necessarily understand the financial situation of a low-income population and who maybe will be promoting products that will not be desirable for that population. It's important for every player in the solar space to be giving attention and, frankly, more attention to consumer protection than's happened up till now. States can ensure they have strong regulations. The solar industry can take additional actions to police members of the industry. Local community organizations can be monitoring what's going on in their community. So that topic is one that we think deserves very straight and strong attention. The last thing I want to talk about here is shared solar projects can play a useful role, but they are not a panacea. Again, going back to what I was saying before, shared solar projects, which sometimes folks in the solar industry call community solar projects, have sometimes been held up as the ideal way to benefit the low and moderate income population, because you don't need to have the installation on someone's roof. It can be a central location. Renters can benefit. Folks who don't have suitable roofs can benefit. And that can play a useful role. But it's only a part of the solution to the issue of how to use solar to benefit under-resourced communities. There can be some significant consumer protection issues involved. There can be cases where it's not so easy to work out the finances of the project, so you have really significant and proportionate participation by low and moderate income populations. And on top of that, it can lead to some bill savings, but not necessarily to the community empowerment and wealth building that we hope will happen as solar advances in under-resourced communities. So we talk about that in our report. Those are some of our general recommendations. What I want to do is show you some of the recommendations for other groups. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want you to see what we're talking about, and you can then decide, which chapters are most relevant for you to read in the report. So for state governments, we talk about things like measuring progress towards energy equity and adopting special incentives and policies. Then, in our recommendations for philanthropic foundations, we talked about supporting frontline organizations with unrestricted multi-year grants, investing in projects with a strategic focus, providing funding to determine the most viable community empowerment models, things like that. So there's a whole chapter on foundations. We have a chapter for community organizations and the role they could play. And we suggest one starting point is that they should be insisting on being involved in projects that take place in their community and playing an important connecting role between other actors and the residents of a community, pushing for community benefits agreements to ensure that the benefits actually do flow to the community. We don't want a situation where we end up with a lot of solar panels in under-resourced communities, but people look around and they say, all the financial benefits are going to outsiders, not to us who lives here. We encourage community organizations to think about how they can control the decision-making process. We have a chapter for other stakeholders, particularly for the solar industry and municipalities, where we encourage businesses to have a plan for workforce development and self-police to ensure high consumer protection standards. We talk about the way in which local communities can also support solar in ways that benefit low and moderate income communities and residents. And we talk about the role of large electricity users. The chapter on project finance, that's a crucial chapter because one of the real issues here is that it's not so easy to finance large-scale projects in under-resourced communities. We need to do more in that regard. There's a range of things that are underway across the country, such as trying to use alternatives to FICO credit scores and trying to de-risk project finance for financial institutions and borrowers. We have several interesting case studies of different organizations that have tried different strategies to increase the amount of money flowing into under-resourced communities to finance solar. We have case studies from, in this chapter, from Fellowship Energy talking about private financing for religious institutions, from Revolve talking about crowdsourcing funding, Sunwealth grouping a range of projects in both under-resourced communities and others, combining them together to make it more attractive to invest in low and moderate income projects. And earlier in the report, we have a case study about a major initiative from the Kresge Foundation, which is going to talk about where they're putting significant money into things like loan guarantees and other credit enhancements to make it attractive for major developers of affordable housing to incorporate solar. Well, one of the things that came up a lot in the report was around the issue of project ownership and empowerment. There are many people in under-resourced communities who want to ensure that solar is developed in a way that leads to empowerment, and sometimes it's presented, well, this can only happen if they actually own the project. And some other folks have said, no, that's bad. People should never own the project. And we talk about that, and basically the way we came down on this is that we believe that communities and community representatives should shape the decisions that are made, and they should take steps to make sure that there are adequate community benefits. Now, sometimes that can best be achieved by owning the project, and we have a case study in there of a project by Push Buffalo that involves ownership by that organization. But before assuming that ownership is the right way to go, community organizations should do an honest self-assessment. They should decide, do they have the appetite and expertise to be a solar project developer? Do they have the resources to withstand an unexpected financial loss? And when you're involved in taking steps as a developer and an owner, there's always the possibility of loss, even if the possibility is low. Do they have the appetite for that? Now, if an organization concludes that they shouldn't be a developer, they don't have the appetite to actually own the project, that doesn't mean they need to give up control. Well-structured contracts can realize economic benefits without ownership risks. A community organization can initiate, control, and make the decisions about a solar installation. Then a third-party entity can own the system and take responsibility for maintaining it. That third-party entity can also qualify for the federal tax credit. In some cases, there can be a hybrid approach in which the community organization brings in a partner with solar development experience. The partner withdraws after 5 to 10 years after they've received the tax benefit, and then they leave the community group with the ownership. And we have a case study of Uprose in Brooklyn, New York, where that model was followed. And that can be a very effective approach, but folks have to be careful to make sure that the fact that ownership transfer is going to be delayed doesn't mean that financial benefits will also be delayed. Well, before I turn this over to questions, I had two last things I want to say. One is, this is a rapidly changing field. There's a lot going on. We welcome your comments. We welcome your suggestions on other ideas that we should try to get out there to the broader public. And then the second thing I want you to see in our report, if you go through it, one thing we've really tried to do is to highlight and elevate the wide range of voices that have very important perspectives on solar development in under-resourced communities, perspectives that deserve to be heard. And you'll see scattered through the report photos and quotes from a lot of the people we talked to. We did interviews with 82 people from 76 organizations, general interviews. Then we did, in addition to that, interviews with another 15 or 20 people for the case studies. So there's a lot of folks who contributed to this report, and I encourage you to take a look to see who they were. Let me turn it back over to Nate.
Great. Thanks, Warren. Thanks, Danielle. Thanks, Chandra. So we're going to move into Q&A, and we're already getting a lot of great questions. I do want to encourage you, if you have a question, you can type it into the box, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. First question, one of the recommendations was around special incentives for under-resourced communities for solar. What kinds of incentives are available? And the questioner specifically asked about housing authorities. Any project examples or case studies on this?
Well, it's really quite state-specific, and sometimes it's even specific to a particular utility area or a municipality. People really have to look at what's available in their location. We have an interesting case study from the Denver Housing Authority, an initiative they did to develop a large shared solar installation that's benefited many folks in the Denver area. They were able to do that because of the incentives that were available specifically in Colorado at that time. So I can't give a blanket answer. You really have to look at what's available in your particular location.
Great, and I might also note that, for example, California has a multifamily housing, solar on multifamily housing program called SOMA. That's a capacity-based financial incentive as well, and that's mentioned in the report too. Next question, the questioner says, NYSERDA has funded pre-development work to support LMI and community-based solar. Have any other states done this? This might be a good chance to mention Oregon's work.
Yes, yeah, different states have done this in different ways, and Energy Trust of Oregon has a very interesting model. We encourage you to read the case study there, because this is an approach that we'd encourage other states to adopt as well. What they did in Oregon was they first spent time doing the sorts of communication with representatives from community groups, the type of communication that we're really promoting. And then they learned about the needs of those groups. And so what they did was a small grant program to provide resources to local groups to develop projects. And I think from both the Oregon experience and the New York experience, the level of grants does not need to necessarily be all that large to make a difference. One of the facts about community organizations in under-resourced communities is that those organizations are themselves under-resourced. They have small staffs, they have small budgets. Oftentimes, a grant of even $5,000 or $10,000 is enough to get that organization the breathing space and the resources to really be able to think about how they can develop solar in a way that's going to provide meaningful benefits to their community.
Great, thanks. Can you suggest, one of the recommendations was around engaging frontline communities, and can you suggest ways to engage under-resourced communities? What approaches by whom and in what manner should be used for this?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. It's an important question, and it's hard to generalize, especially the approach that a, say, solar company takes when they're looking to enter a community is very different than the approach a state agency might want to take when it's looking to design a program, or the approach a foundation might want to take when it's looking to think about what sorts of grants it wants to give out. So in a general way, and this is going to probably sound simple-minded, it means starting to talk with folks, and it means giving folks oftentimes the resources so that they have the time and ability to engage. Sometimes just inviting folks to a conference is not going to get them there if you're not able to provide them with travel support, for example. I go back to look in our report at the case study for Energy Trust of Oregon on how they did outreach there. I would also let folks know that Nicole Hernandez-Hammer of our staff is working on a report with some of the states we've been working with, which will a report that will come out in a few months that will provide more guidance for how state agencies in particular can work with and get input from community organizations. But that won't be out for a few months, but I'd encourage you to look out for it. Thanks, Nate.
Next question. Did the project team identify any projects that utilize programs such as credit enhancements offered by state green banks?
Well, we have a couple of the case studies are relevant to that. One is we do have a case study of the Kresge Foundation's credit enhancement program, which is just going to be rolled out soon. and you could take a look at that case study. That is quite relevant to the issue of credit enhancements. On top of that, the Connecticut Green Bank, there's a case study of the work that they've done in the state of Connecticut, where they rolled out a program aimed at single-family homeowners who are low and moderate income. And as part of that, there are some credit enhancement elements that made it attractive for the solar company Posigen to enter that market and very successfully market to single-family homeowners in that state. Nate, are you on?
Oh, yes, thank you. Quick question about workforce development efforts and effective strategies for workforce development in under-resourced communities.
Yes. Let me say a couple of things. There are some organizations out there that have done very good and effective efforts at workforce development, and we talk about those in the report. Grid Alternatives is an organization that's done workforce development in a number of locations and done it quite effectively. Elevate Energy has had effective programs in the state of Illinois. One of the real issues in terms of workforce development in under-resourced communities is it really needs to be workforce development, not job training. What sometimes has happened is that there's a training program that's linked to a solar development, but there's no mechanism to get the folks who go through the program to end up with jobs at the other end of the road. If there's just a one-shot installation project and there's nothing else in the pipeline, it's creating false expectations to do a lot of job training for jobs that aren't going to follow. So there needs to be an overall strategy that looks at how are we going to get people some initial training, but how's that going to lead to jobs at the end of the road? And sometimes those jobs, as much as we want them to be in the solar industry, and it's great for them to be in the solar industry, sometimes the job training can also lead to other jobs in other aspects of the construction industry, for example, or other aspects of clean energy. But it needs to be a clear strategy from the beginning, and oftentimes it makes sense to spend time talking to the workforce development folks in that state or in that city to see how do you design something that's going to really make sense.
Great. Next question: what sources of information did you and the study team use to identify case studies for the report?
Well, let me talk about the sources of information we use more generally in our research, and then I'll come back to the case studies. There's been a lot very good written on this topic. We don't claim to be the first or the only ones to have written something that's relevant. And there's an extensive bibliography at the end that describes other materials that folks should look at and learn from, because there's a lot out there. And we started by looking at all that other stuff. We then interviewed 82 people. And as we were interviewing them, and also when we had the initial kickoff meeting that Chandra talked about early on, every time we talked to folks, we said, which projects out there do you think are really successful, have real potential for the future, can be replicated? And so we basically got our list of case studies from all those interviews, from that research, and we picked things that we thought could be done more widely. And we weren't just focusing on a project because we said, hey, that's a great project, everybody should just support them in that one location. We tried to do things that we thought would be generic models that could be implemented by other organizations as well.
Thanks. Next question is about nonprofit organizations and solar on nonprofit organizations, for example, churches, schools. What are the special considerations that need to be thought about for solar on these types of institutions?
Well, one key consideration is that those sorts of institutions cannot qualify for the solar tax credit because they're tax exempt. And so oftentimes it means partnering with a solar developer or some other entity who has a tax appetite, who can benefit from the tax credit, therefore improving the total finances for the project, and then sharing some of those extra benefits with the local nonprofit organization. Another consideration is that especially in under-resourced communities, nonprofit organizations don't have a lot of resources. As I mentioned earlier on, financial risk is a key factor. The project needs to be constructed in a way that risks are very low. On top of that, the organization sometimes is not creditworthy. It doesn't have deep pockets, and there can be ways to link that organization to another organization that is creditworthy, who can help the local group get financing for the project. That's been the model of Fellowship Energy, which is one of the case studies in the report, where they've linked local congregations to a national religious body that has deeper pockets, who can serve as being a creditworthy backstop for the project.
Thanks. Next question. Any specific strategies for rural communities?
The strategies aren't so different than in the urban areas. I'm not sure I have all that detailed a response other than to say two things. In a lot of rural communities, there are rural electric co-ops, and those organizations, by their nature, often feel a real bond with the local community, a real desire to take steps to benefit financially the folks in their service territories, and oftentimes may be more open to promoting solar for low and moderate income households because they'll see it in their mission. And a good example of that is Kit Carson Rural Electric Co-op in the state of New Mexico, which has really embraced this topic in a very impressive way. So one, in rural areas, look at opportunities to work with rural electric co-ops. A second thing is, we talked about shared solar arrays. One way to benefit low and moderate income households is there are farmers in parts of the country who are just getting by. They have limited incomes, limited wealth. Placing a shared solar array on their land, a shared solar array that will be subscribed by a large number of people in the surrounding area, it can be a way to provide some real economic benefits to that farm that allows them to keep their land and maintain prosperity.
Given all the things under-resourced communities have to think about and consider, how do you raise the profile of solar and encourage communities, under-resourced communities, to think about solar?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In fact, all these questions have been very good questions. And that was one of the things we talked about in the section on obstacles. One of the issues is these communities have a lot of issues they need to address. Economic issues, issues having to do with racial justice, issues having to do with housing, having to do with transportation. It can often be hard to get the bandwidth to focus on solar. And folks need to acknowledge that at the beginning, that someone in an under-resourced community who doesn't spend all their time thinking about solar, that doesn't mean they're a bad person or they don't care about the environment, but they have a lot of competing demands on their time and attention. Coming up with looking for those places where it's both easy to do, where it's going to be very visible, so it's going to have an educational value, so folks will learn about it naturally, and focusing on those places where people can feel engaged and that there's a real potential for getting community wealth building. That's going to make it possible to get people to focus on it and move forward with action.
Great, thanks. We're going to do one last question, and then I'm going to give Danielle and Warren just a chance to say a few parting words. I know Chandra had to go, so but for our last question, this commenter says, I'm glad to hear you included recommendations for foundations. What are your follow-up plans to help encourage funders to implement these ideas?
Well, you know, we really appreciate the fact that the Nathan Cummings Foundation and the Solutions Project played such a central role in getting this project off the ground. And because they are part of the funder community, they have the ear of that community, and they have the ability to help us get our findings and recommendations out to that community. In fact, we had a briefing just yesterday that was arranged by the Nathan Cummings Foundation. We had a briefing for some funders, and we'll be doing more of that in the future.
If I could say a very quick word on that, Warren. The session yesterday generated a lot of interest. It was with the Nathan Cummings Foundation hosted, but in collaboration with the Climate and Energy Funders Group, as well as the Neighborhood Funders Group. And for the Neighborhood Funders Group, they're coming at this with an economic opportunity lens and looking at clean energy as one area that they know is booming that can provide benefits. Others are coming at it sort of with the clean energy climate interest first. And so we'll be looking to make sure to do some implementation work on that and emphasizing for funders how critical it is when they're doing this work to have an equity lens and to be fostering the kind of partnerships that led to this report, where you get people from different perspectives weighing in and giving their opinions.
Great, thanks. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, but before signing off and telling you about a couple of other upcoming webinars related to this report, Danielle, I wanted to just give you a quick chance to say a sentence or two if you have any wrap-up thoughts.
Sorry, I was on mute. Just sincere thanks to echo a point I had earlier on about the importance of partnerships that bring people with different strengths together. To have CESA come together with its network was done because we had an eye on implementation. A report alone, of course, is valuable, but the network and the experience that they have coupled with the folks that really have the air of communities on the ground, made for a much richer report and feedback. And that investment in process and time just pays off in spades. It's a high return on investment. So it just encourage the partners that are on the phone as they look to engage this, again, not just for moral reasons, but looking at the political reasons why it's critical to have greater inclusion, to make sure that they pay attention to process and engagement as well. Thank you so much again for this terrific work and for the patience and energy. It was a joy.
Thanks, Danielle. And Warren, I want to give you a chance to say any wrap-up thoughts too, and in the process, perhaps you could address one other question that came in, which is where can you get a copy of this report?
Yes. The report is available on the CESA website, CESA.org. You'll see it right on our homepage. You'll also afterwards be able to see the recording of this webinar, download the slides. We have a Spanish translation of the executive summary. So there's a lot of stuff there. And for my last comments, read the report. And this is a sort of mutual love society here. We really appreciated the support of the Nathan Cummings Foundation and Danielle in particular. And on top of that, the other organizations who we work with as part of the report. It was a real joy to work with all of them.
Great. Thanks to you both. Thanks to our audience. Samantha, I'm going to turn it back over to you to tell the audience about a couple of related webinars and then to close out.
Sure, thanks, Nate. So we do have a few webinars coming up in January related to this Solar with Justice report. The first is on January 16th, and it includes recommendations for community organizers. The second webinar in this, or the third webinar rather, in the series has recommendations for state governments. So we encourage you to attend those. Again, details for those are on our website, CESA.org/webinars. So sign up today. We may have another in that series, so stay tuned. And thank you everybody for attending our webinar today. I think that does it for our presentation, so we hope to see you at the next one.